Hi, if you want to watch exclusive content with hot girls that you won't watch on YouTube, namely where Naruto roasts Kushina and Mikoto and many other hot girls without restrictions, then visit my Boosty channel at the link in the description.
F. Kanahagakur. This settlement is called the village hidden in the leaves, but it's hard to call this city a village. Carved into a huge rock face, the faces of 4 men, former shinobi leaders who inhabited this city, silently watched over the life of the metropolis, aglow with a web of lanterns illuminating the roads that stretched through the forest. Yes, this place has become home to thousands of gifted people whose ancestors chose the path of war. In this bloodthirsty world, reveling in the suffering of mortals, the art of killing is elevated to absolute perfection, and naturally, this has its consequences. Even now, on a hot summer night, on a day of mourning, marking the 10th anniversary of the Nine-Tailed Demon's attack and the celebration of its defeat, there were people taking out their pain on the innocent and uninvolved. 10 years ago, the Kyubi no Yoko nearly destroyed Konoha, and only thanks to the sacrifice of the 4th Hokage, the village's ruler himself, was it saved. Before his death, he managed to seal the powerful demon fox within the body of his own son. Seeing the boy now, the 4th would be horrified and perhaps would direct all his wrath at the village for which he gave his life. Sadly, instead of honoring and respecting little Naruto Uzumaki as his father wished, he was forced to bear the full hatred of the villagers. Uninformed people were pained by the loss of their loved ones and illogically identified the blue-eyed boy with the fox demon, which is why young Uzumaki often found himself in situations like today. Naruto was an observant and intelligent child. From childhood, he'd noticed the angry glances directed at him, heard the quiet whispers dripping with hatred, and when he was indifferently thrown out of the orphanage where he'd at least occasionally felt safe, that's when he encountered all the injustice of this world, the gift and curse of being an empath. When he graduated, the authorities cut his orphanage allowance by a couple of thousand yen, leaving him just enough to survive on, while at the market, the opposite was true. The merchants jacked up prices to 2 or 3 times their cost, specifically for the boy. And in every look, in every word, he felt disgust, anger, and pain. However, the harsh orphanage upbringing and his innate ability to overcome any adversity took their toll, and the boy only occasionally complained about the difficulty of dodging the stones flying at him. And although he hid his sorrow behind a ringing laugh and petty mischief, his eyes almost always reflected his true thoughts. The 10-year-old boy had come to terms with how people treated him, but instead of becoming embittered by the villagers, he set out to earn their respect by becoming the strongest shinobi of his time. Without a doubt, overcoming pain and hatred, he would have achieved this, if not for chance. On the day of mourning, the boy preferred to stay home and keep his nose down, no matter what was happening outside. It's understandable, considering that the year before last, drunken shinobi nearly killed him by locking Naruto in a burning barn on the outskirts of the village. And while he'd been lucky that time, a gray-haired man in a solid white mask with red stripes and his left eye blazing scarlet with rage pulled the unconscious Naruto out of the burning house. It left a bad taste in his mouth. Oh, he tried to find this man with the snow-white mane, if only to express his gratitude, but all his attempts were in vain. He seemed to have vanished into thin air. However, for some reason, the boy often caught someone's attentive gaze on him, and quite logically assumed that an unknown savior was watching him from the shadows. But at the same time, he was perplexed why the man refused to communicate. However, young Uzumaki was mistaken. Something unexpected happened that day. What the cold-blooded Sharingan overlooked was seen by entirely different eyes. It was at that moment that the nine-tailed demon fox first awakened within the boy, healing all of Uzumaki's burns and saving its host from carbon monoxide suffocation. Even defeated twice, humiliated, and imprisoned in a near-perfect prison, the Kyubi retained its will to live. For 3 years, Golden Eyes watched the boy, noticing the subtle details and insignificant nuances that nonetheless still influence Hiruto's life. And then, at a moment when Uzumaki once again found himself in a hopeless situation, the observer decided to intervene, disrupting the stable, well-orchestrated chain of events and shattering the destinies of millions of inhabitants of this world. A flash of white light illuminated one of the dark alleys on the outskirts of Konoha, frequented only by root soldiers, and then only for special reasons. As if out of nowhere, a foot that shouldn't have existed stepped onto the ground. Heavy military boots, the kind you wouldn't find on Konoha's store shelves, struck the stone with a loud metallic clang. A black robe flapped violently in the wind generated by the energy surge, and beneath the hood that obscured his features, 2 amber suns flared, oozing with a toxic irritation. Smoothing his tunic slightly, the young man straightened up and, with obvious difficulty, took a few steps forward, exiting the alley and looking around the busy street he had found himself on. "Well, I thought I missed," he muttered quietly, and the dull irritation in his eyes gave way to satisfaction. Oh, the city was bustling with life. Celebration and mourning mingled that night. People rejoiced at having simply survived that fateful day, 10 years since, and mourned those they had lost. And the world welcomed the stranger, rejoiced at the opportunity to become whole and alive, but simultaneously saddened by the fact that in exchange, the stranger would take away what was most precious to it. "Well, we'll see what happens without them." The stranger's head was hidden by a deep hood, but his voice betrayed a curious smirk. "Excuse me," the stranger addressed the first Konoha resident he encountered. "I'm looking for a boy, about 10 years old. Blonde, blue eyes. About this height." The tipsy girl narrowed her eyes suspiciously, watching as the stranger extended his hand in front of him, measuring a little over a meter from the ground. "Don't you know someone like that? There are plenty of kids running around Konoha," the wiry villager grumbled back, tucking a strand of black hair behind her ear. "Maybe I do, but I won't tell you." "Who are you, exactly?" "Oh, I'm just a wanderer," the man replied, waving his hand in front of him with a relaxed gesture, his eyes gleaming from beneath his hood. "There's no cause for concern, believe me." The amber suns flared contentedly as the drunk shinobi's eyes narrowed toward her nose, her face relaxing into serene calm. "So will you help me?" "Very well," the shinobi snorted, a hint of doubt in her voice. "If you're looking to meet the demon, you can follow the street to the edge of the village, then turn right 2 blocks from the wall. The bastard lives in a half-rotted house, where he belongs," the girl replied, oozing venom. "Thank you very much," the wanderer said, bowing slightly and throwing a bag of gold to the drunk woman. He slowly wandered off in the direction indicated. The wanderer strode curiously around the city's main square, seemingly oblivious to the assassins watching him from the rooftops, their faces hidden by painted masks. The stranger's golden eyes darted from building to building, glittering with flashing signs that lured shadow warriors into small, cozy taverns, eateries promising a tasty and inexpensive lunch, clothing and equipment stores, bookstores, grocery stores, and other places essential to the city's normal life. Today, on this day of celebration and mourning, these establishments were either adorned with a variety of decorations or yawned with sparsely empty windows draped with black curtains, a further reminder of the duality of this memorable date. However, in both places, sake flowed freely, warming and invigorating the former, and soothing the lingering wounds of the latter. Passing yet another dive bar, from which cheerful shouts emanated, the man winced at the stench of alcohol filling the air, but then tensed. Besides the acrid smell of alcohol, he detected the cloying, sweet aroma of decay and rot, wafting as if from underground. "Root," he whispered quietly, quickening his pace. Yes, he knew a lot about this village, perhaps even more than the average resident. The stranger, who had never set foot in these lands before, knew of a secret organization led by one of the village's current ruler's advisors. Although no one noticed, his lips curled into a contemptuous grin. A secret group within a secret group. A counter-sabotage unit of the security service, performing the dirtiest work in the village. It would seem they have something to respect. Competent, skilled, and most importantly, obedient warriors, ready to crush anyone at the mercy of Shimura Danzo. But the trouble is, thanks to Root and its leaders, even those who never even considered harming Konoha were killed. The unprincipled and ruthless leader of Root slaughtered those who displeased him, hiding behind the familiar and utterly repulsive slogan, "For the common good." Perhaps that was the case initially, but over time, Danzo's ambitions outstripped common sense. "A fish rots from the head," the stranger snorted sadly, looking down at his feet. And yet, sensing surveillance, the man quickened his pace slightly. While he could have completely hidden from the sight of the seasoned killers, slipping away as quickly as he had appeared, that wasn't part of his plan. The Wanderer wanted Konoha's leadership to know of his actions on their soil. Oh, he imagined their faces, filled with mute shock, when they realized their trump card, their means of deterrence and intimidation, would simply vanish from the village, without a trace, and forever. However, it must be admitted that he was interested not so much in the reaction of the Hokage and his advisors as in that of a single, nameless exile. He wanted to savor the impotent fury of the one-eyed man in the orange mask. Obito Uchiha. He was the one who had borne the brunt of the harsh reality of the shinobi world. No wonder the boy had become embittered. Snorting, the man considered. Perhaps he should pay a visit to the seemingly invulnerable Uchiha? No, first, Naruto and his demon. Striding along the pavement, the stranger, without even noticing, reached a miserable, shabby house. Peeling paint, cracks in the walls, broken windows here and there, and dim lights from electric lamps. This dwelling had probably seen Hashirama, and in all fairness, it should have been torn down long ago, but somewhere, after all, society's dregs have to be housed. In short, the building, which had clearly once been an ordinary barn and now merely had small additions, was miraculously holding up under the onslaught of a group of drunks. A loudly shouting, curse-filled crowd, no more than 10 people, hurled stones at the windows of the long-suffering house. The residents, neither particularly bright nor particularly restrained, were thirsty for revenge. They would have torn the boy to pieces on the spot, as they had tried to do before. "He's here! I caught that bastard!" Suddenly, a scream of malicious satisfaction rang out from almost across the street. Looking closer, the stranger spotted his target. He couldn't mistake the wheat-colored hair, stained with blood, for anything else, nor could he fail to recognize that haunted gaze of those blue eyes, as clear as the sky. The boy's frail body was dragged by his hair along the cobbled road, like a sack of potatoes, only quietly howling in pain. Yellow eyes narrowed dangerously, noting the bruises and contusions visible through the torn, dirty jacket and the bloody shreds of pants that had once been orange overalls. Golden eyes narrowed dangerously, noticing small, barely noticeable details. Weakly shaking hands, a twisted posture. A leg dragged behind the body, periodically bending too unnaturally. Slowly but surely, in the depths of his consciousness, rage, restrained by the steel grip of his will, reared its head. The stranger knew in advance that in the future this boy would gain their visible respect, become practically their idol, and even give his life for them, but he would never be able to eradicate their fear of his power. But now, watching the outright mockery of a boy who had essentially done nothing, he sensibly wondered, were his victims worthy of these people's respect? "Guys, don't you think this is a bit over the top?" the stranger asked, pulling back his hood. "That bastard killed my children and my family." The drunken crowd burst into shouts of agreement, listing their dead relatives. "I'll personally rip his guts out." Hearing this phrase, accompanied by the sickening sound of a pair of daggers striking each other, Uzumaki curled up into a ball and closed his eyes in horror. Naruto had never understood why these people were so angry at him, why the children wouldn't talk to him, and why the adults either shrank away from him as if he had the plague or threw stones at him, trying to drive him away, but somehow he himself hadn't become embittered. Even now, looking at the boy, the stranger sensed in him only a desperate desire to end this nightmare, to skip these few hours of pain and torture, to drift off into oblivion and wake up early the next morning in a hospital ward, to return to his childish pranks as if nothing had happened. But the hatred, it simply wasn't there. "Gentlemen, believe me, you don't want to do this," the Wanderer said, smoothing his jet-black hair with a leisurely wave of his hand. "It's getting late, go home. What kind of little demon are you even bothering with? Who the hell are you, bitch? Come on, get out of here while you can still walk, or we'll beat the crap out of you too. Your own mother won't recognize you." The stranger's pointed chin rose, and his weary gaze turned skyward. He sighed heavily, closed his eyes, and squared his shoulders. His appearance did not inspire respect. He was not a brute with whom ordinary people would be unlikely to argue. Quite the contrary. His jet-black robe gave his pale, gaunt face an unnaturally sickly appearance. His sunken cheeks and high cheekbones only accentuated his appearance. Combined with his short stature, frail build, and utterly exhausted expression, it all created the image of a victim, not one capable of ending the mass insanity. "Oh, bitch, I tried to be nice, but sometimes you can't avoid severe physical consequences with fatal consequences." He sighed resignedly, watching with disgust as several people from the crowd ran forward and began breaking their fingers. "Two fires and lightning, ineffective," he stated with disappointment, raising his hand upward, clenching his slender fingers into a fist. "I'll have to tell Yanai that his choking feints really do bring you back to your senses." The stranger snorted with satisfaction, curiously examining the three people floundering in the air in futile attempts to tear the invisible vice from their throats, preventing them from breathing. "Let them go." A warrior in a thick mask materialized in front of the stranger. The stranger tilted his head, puzzled, examining the red stripes. The headdress concealing his identity seemed vaguely familiar, as if the stranger had observed it before. It was this that caught his eye, along with the gray vest and dark trousers, the standard ANBU uniform. The man held himself coolly and evenly, showing no emotion. The stranger could only tilt his head curiously, wondering who exactly had interrupted his lesson, but his gaze slid just above the white mane, characteristically combed back, seemingly electrified, and the left eye of the newcomer, glowing scarlet. The stranger narrowed his eyes. The gray hair and Sharingan marked this man as a rather curious individual, one the yellow-eyed man couldn't help but recognize. However, this man held no value in his eyes. Unlike Naruto, barely alive in body and sparkling with life and spirit, the white-haired man was alive on the outside, but dead on the inside. A man crippled by war, having lost everything he had, but unwilling to reclaim it in any way, and unappreciating the opportunities fate offered to heal his mind. With a slight purse of his lips, the man lowered his hand, and at that very moment, three bodies, suspended above the ground, crashed down with a resounding roar. The man wasn't particularly concerned with the well-being of his victims, but he still felt a certain satisfaction when he caught Naruto Uzumaki's admiring gaze. "And you, get out! Get out!" the ANBU ordered coldly, not taking his eyes off the stranger. The townspeople still showed prudence. And rightly so. If a special forces unit were involved, things were getting serious, and they certainly had no place on a potential battlefield. Throwing dirty curses, the tipsy Konoha residents reluctantly left the deprived quarter, their goal unfulfilled. The Wanderer merely shook his head. He knew how dangerous a frenzied mob could be, knew that sooner or later they would return to this house, and decided to limit himself to just one visit to the boy. Leaving him here would mean killing him and ruining his potential. "Thank you for your help, Kakashi," the stranger said with a soft smile, crossing his arms over his chest. Seeing the change in the ANBU's gaze, he quickly explained. "No need to freak out. You're the only one in this dump with such a luxurious head of hair. Your accomplices were a bit of a challenge." The man snorted, nodding meaningfully toward the nearby treetops. "Hides coughing. I highly recommend seeing a healer. People don't live long with tuberculosis." And the second ANBU, a girl, I don't remember her name, but I know your friend is dating her. Her name? Yugi. Yuga. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The smell is distinctive. The stranger grinned predatorily. You know too well, Ataki said, dropping his hands peacefully, as if to show he only wanted to talk, his whole demeanor making it clear he wasn't even thinking about reaching for the pouches on his belt. Who are you? The multicolored eyes in the slits of his mask narrowed in a friendly manner. Good question, the stranger thought seriously, scratching his chin. Usually a blacksmith and a merchant. Sometimes I sing, sometimes I try to write books. Today, I decided to go for a walk, so you could call me a traveler now. And when I'm in a good mood, I share all sorts of interesting information with those who need it. I'm a versatile person. Anyway, you can call me Kale. The man introduced himself with a slight bow, brushing aside the slight reproach in his thoughts. He had promised not to show off unnecessarily. Okay, Kale. What brings you to Konoha? Kakashi's red eye narrowed, his hand moving ever closer to his kunai pouch. Why all this hostility, Hataki? The man said, offended, nodding at the ANBU's hand sliding toward his dagger and retreating a couple of steps. I'm actually a peaceful person. I just came to talk to the kid. The stranger resisted the urge to turn around and cast a worried glance at the fair-haired boy, who had miraculously not fainted. He was badly beaten, by the way, and if we don't help him, he might even run away. Do you know what will happen if that happens? The Ambu knew. The stranger grinned venomously, sensing the same suppressed urge in Itaki to turn his gaze to the boy, barely able to stay conscious as he lay on the cold concrete behind the gray-haired man. Perhaps the stranger had been mistaken about him, and he truly did feel something for the little guy. Perhaps. In any case, Kakashi, sensing the hidden threat in Kale's words, seized the opportunity to draw a gaping, black, diamond-bladed dagger from his belt and assume a defensive stance. He had no intention of attacking first, and if a fight broke out, he would try to draw this strange man away from Uzumaki. Kale's smile widened as she assessed the man's actions. Kakashi was still young and inexperienced, his movements too slow, jerky, and ragged. He didn't understand what to expect from the stranger. He was nervous, and he was confused. He didn't know how to act in such a difficult situation. On the one hand, there had just been a hint of a demon being released, something Kakashi couldn't allow, but on the other, this man definitely didn't wish the boy any harm. It all seemed too suspicious, too wrong. Just like back then. Kakashi's Sharingan widened, desperate to see the impossible truth in a wild proposition. What makes you think I'm the same man who attacked the late Hokage's wife 10 years ago? The stranger asked sarcastically, looking irresponsibly, one might almost say, into Itaki's glowing scarlet eye. I'm not wearing a mask, Kakashi. Unlike your old friend, I don't wear such tasteless headdresses. I don't possess the Sharingan. I'm not an Uchiha. I'm not seeking revenge on my former teacher, and I have no ties to the village. This is the first time I've seen you in person, unlike him. His golden eyes narrowed slightly. Come on, think about it. Think about who came for the Jinchuriki back then. The dagger in the silver-haired assassin's hands trembled as the image of a long-dead boy, buried under rocks, flashed before his Sharingan. An old friend. A loud, clumsy, eternally irritating Uchiha. Kakashi knew only one like him. But Obito was dead. Traded his life for Kakashi's. He was buried under rocks in a nameless cave. All that remained of him was the Sharingan in Itaki's eye and the name on the memorial plaque where Kakashi. He flees society, wallowing in his own grief and the pain of losing all his loved ones. A lie! The killer's scarlet eye flashed with rage, and at that very moment, the black blade released from the white-haired man's hands rushed toward the wanderer's chest. Well, yeah. The man snorted sarcastically, the kunai hovering in front of his body. Just like your father was systematically driven to suicide, just like they allowed the situation with Rin to happen, just like they sold you the Hizashi to lightning, might die, Uchiha sure sway. Half the memorial plaque you constantly whine about died just because it was profitable. Kale spat, unable to contain his anger. Kakashi, you disgust me. You can't even protect your own teacher's son from attacks. You're practically a little brother, Hataki. How do you even live with that? The man growled, ignoring the piece of metal that had fallen at his feet. Where the gray-haired Umbu had previously been cold and collected, now pure hatred poured from the eye slits of his mask. Kakashi couldn't understand how this man, who had never set foot on village soil before, could learn of events that could only be called the darkest stain on Konoha's history. He couldn't accept it. What did this stranger know of war, of the sacrifices they made for peace, albeit a fragile one? But even more hurtful was the realization that this smirking man was telling the truth. He, Kakashi Hatake, had only helped the fourth Hokage's son escape once. He lacked the strength to be more than a silent, invisible observer for the boy. Everyone close to him sooner or later died right before his eyes. He couldn't become attached to the Uzumaki. The loss of another loved one would simply kill him, turning him completely and irrevocably from a man into a weapon. And your actions in the future, which won't happen. Honestly, you've disappointed me, kid. Even when you had the chance, you didn't believe in the kid. And he would have saved you from yourself. Kale finished wearily, bowing his head dejectedly. Enough talk, the killer replied coldly. You will either leave the village or die. Kakashi, take a rest, okay? The wanderer asked softly, raising his hand. Hatake was completely powerless to resist the unknown force that swept his body like a leaf falling from a tree. As he soared into the air, he felt a battering ram strike his chest, and only after recovering from the pain did he realize he was flying backwards, almost to the other side of the city. Twisting in midair, he adjusted his trajectory with a powerful burst of chakra and crashed onto one of the roofs of the poor houses on the outskirts of the village. Meanwhile, the stranger, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction, dusted off his hands, ignoring the two unconscious bodies that had fallen from the thick branches of the nearby trees. He turned away from them, focusing his gaze on the bleeding boy, and slowly approached Uzumaki, who, despite the wanderer's words and actions, was reluctant to show trust. Life had weaned him off this flaw, erasing it from him. Kale didn't like the boy's wary, hunted gaze directed at him at all. The man's heart skipped a beat. Broken limbs, a cracked rib, a bruise covering half his head. In just 5 minutes, he simply sympathized with the boy, forced to survive in this world under the very real blows of fate. Whatever the child, he didn't deserve such treatment. But that was the problem. These drunkards saw him not as a weak 10-year-old, but as a nine-tailed demon, and they took out their anger on him. But if you imagined it, in the future, he would turn into a truly handsome man, the likes of which you'd never find. His face, swollen from bruises, didn't hide his perfect features from the scrutinizing gaze of his golden eyes. His bloodied nose somehow retained its perfect straight shape, and in his bright blue eyes, he saw an almost extinguished hope and gratitude. For a man who had been through the horrors of life, such moments simply became terrifying, and he wondered if there were limits to human madness. I won't hurt you, the man promised, carefully sitting down next to the boy's body, a warm smile crossing his face. I've come a long way to meet you, Naruto, he said, examining the boy's broken arm with sympathy. Will you allow me? Kale asked, bowing his head slightly and extending a slender hand to the injured elbow. Mistrust still suffused his pale face, yet a discerning eye could have discerned a glimmer of hope. After a moment's thought, Uzumaki nodded his head slightly, groaning in pain. I'm not very good at healing, but I can mend bones, the wanderer said quietly but confidently, moving his hand near the injured area. It should feel a little better now, the man said, his golden eyes flashing with satisfaction, watching as the unnaturally bent elbow snapped back into place. Does it hurt? No, the boy croaked barely audibly, feeling his hand. Who are you? That's a long story, Naruto. The man shook his head. It's better to move to a more comfortable place. Besides, lying on a cold stone wouldn't do you any good, do you think? He smiled, straightening up to his full height. Do you live far away? No, Uzumaki answered honestly, That house over there is mine, he said, pointing his finger towards the far barn down the street and trying to get up. Don't move. Conserve your strength. Kale smiled warmly, waving his hand. I'll carry you. To the boy's delighted, if carefully concealed, surprise, his body rose into the air and slowly floated after the silent man, who was surveying the buildings on the empty streets of the dispossessed quarter with obvious disgust, until he reached the most decaying house on the street. The fact that this shed hadn't collapsed under the weight of numerous outbuildings and the passage of time commanded some respect for the builders, but it was more than offset by his anger at the officials who had housed the fourth son in this dump. They could have at least sent him to the sealed Uzumaki quarter. True, the houses there weren't the best, having been badly damaged by the Kyuubi's attack, but it was certainly better than this crooked and cracked building, surely dating back to Madara Uchiha. Dilapidated, rotting, overgrown with a multitude of outbuildings. It was hard to even call it a slum. After leading the man, who hadn't noticed the thick layers of dirt under his feet and on the walls, to his apartment, Naruto was finally able to relax. Yeah, man, I imagined it differently, Kale said with some respect, looking around the apartment. Inside, it was strikingly different from the outside. Yes, the floors creaked under heavy boots, the walls cracked, the ceiling moldy. He expected to see that, but the boy pleasantly surprised the wanderer with his housekeeping. It was clear that, despite everything, Naruto valued his accommodations. The wooden floors were polished to a shine, the flimsy, narrow bed, visible from the doorway, meticulously made. The windows, old and dingy from years gone by, were washed and scrubbed. And there were no instant noodle packages on the table. And most importantly, somehow Naruto managed to maintain a faint sense of comfort in his home. Despite its shortcomings, Kale was a pleasure to be here. What are you talking about? The guy asked, following the wanderer into the apartment. I like what I see, the man replied, giving Uzumaki another smile. How are you? Can you walk? Already, yes. Naruto shook his hair confidently, then blushed and muttered quietly, without raising his head. Thank you. Glad to help. Kale chuckled, slowly moving his hand, causing the boy's body to gently fall to the floor. Wait a minute. Waving his arms above the boy's head once again, the man smiled contentedly. What did you do? Uzumaki asked, flinching as if expecting a blow. Just cleaning, the wanderer chuckled. I know your hot water's off, but this way you won't have to stand under cold water and wash your clothes, he explained, glancing reproachfully out the window and sighing dreamily. Listen, I don't know about you, but I'm hungry. I have a few packs of ramen left, Naruto said with an embarrassed smile, putting his hand behind his head. I'd be glad if you'd join me. Kale's eyes widened in surprise, not expecting such words from the boy. He appreciated the offer. In fact, this child was offering him the last thing he had. Snorting, Kale crouched down in front of the boy and gazed intently into his blue eyes. The boy, without realizing it, had once again astonished him to the depths of his soul with a seemingly ordinary act. The boy knew that after this dinner he would starve, maybe for a week, maybe more. He simply didn't have the means to survive in this hostile society, in this aggressive village he still called home, but he was still willing to at least show his gratitude in this way. It was amazing how, despite such a life, he had managed to retain such kindness and self-sacrifice. And no, these were far from the mental attitudes that filled Uzumaki's mind. This was a sincere and pure desire, dictated by the boy's moral and ethical standards. It was touching. Thank you, Naruto, the man sighed, maintaining eye contact. But actually, I wanted to treat you. You can't go long on ramen alone, and you need your strength. Ruffling the boy's hair, the man chuckled again and walked into the kitchen. Especially since you're young and growing. You need vitamins, not chemicals, he said admonishingly, sitting down at the table. I certainly respect your tastes, he immediately clarified, seeing the expected indignation on Uzumaki's face. But you have to admit, This looks and smells just as good." With a conspiratorial wink, Kale snapped his fingers, and a rift in space opened in the middle of the kitchen, from which floated a tray full of food that the boy had either never seen or could only dream of trying. "I recommend trying pilaf made according to Grandma's recipe." The man smiled affectionately, observing the confusion on Uzumaki's face. "And this? Can I have some hashi?" the boy asked, even more embarrassed, scratching the back of his head again. "Right, you're eating with chopsticks," Kale muttered, reproaching himself, barely restraining himself from slapping his forehead. "Excuse me." The metal objects, strange to Naruto, disappeared from the tray, replaced by the familiar wooden skewers. "Help yourself." I smiled encouragingly, noticing how the boy hesitated, his hand hovering over the bamboo chopsticks. "This can't be true," he muttered, lowering his head, but even so, his face betrayed the despair and sadness that tormented his soul. "Is this a dream? A genjutsu?" Uzumaki asked, looking up at the puzzled Kale with a pained gaze. "This is all very real," the man said, squinting slightly. "You wanted to change everything, and I'm here to make your wish come true," he said, putting down his chopsticks. "Thank you, but I can't accept your help," the guy whispered without raising his head, causing another flash of surprise from Kale. The man frowned, frantically recalling the etiquette of a distant land. It seemed as if he'd heard of a similar characteristic of this mentality long ago. Rubbing his temples, and completely oblivious to the strands of black hair that had escaped his hair, Kale rose from his rickety chair and, slowly circling the shabby table, stood next to Naruto. He sensed the boy's despair, almost consuming him. He knew he was trying to hide behind the mask of a stubborn, mischievous little brat, shouting that he would become the next Hokage and force everyone to respect and love him. But deep down, he knew he was completely alone, with no one to rely on. Naruto was used to surviving and existing, not living. "Naruto," the stranger asked softly, sitting down next to the boy, causing the boy to flinch. "I know you're not used to asking for help. I know you weren't raised that way, but the rules instilled in you can't hide the truth from me. I see how the pain of loneliness is slowly devouring your soul. I can almost physically feel your despair and your incomprehension of the hatred directed at you," Kale said in a low baritone, staring insistently into the boy's teary blue eyes. "Once upon a time, a long time ago, I went through something similar myself," he admitted, bowing his head slightly and placing a hand over his heart. "There was a time in my life when all my friends abandoned me, when I was completely alone. Then I was betrayed by the country for whose well-being I dedicated my entire life. Naruto, I was declared an enemy. My former subordinates hunted me like an animal until I took up arms and drenched the gala." The man trailed off and looked pointedly at the boy's tear-stained face. "I don't want that fate for you, Naruto. I don't want the blood of the enemies of a state that doesn't value you on your hands." Kale rasped, his eyes flashing, his fists clenched. "I don't want you to lay down your life to serve people who treat you like a mad animal," he said, standing up. "And they will never change their attitude. Believe me, when behind the screen of feigned respect you see disgust and fear directed at you and your family, you will feel the pain again, only you will hardly be able to bear it," the man said quietly, clearly dredging up the worst memories. "Is it worth it?" he asked, rising from the floor and sighing loudly. The boy shook his head, no longer even trying to hold back the hot tears. Kale didn't want to upset the boy. It would be cruel and inhumane, but now was the perfect time. The stranger didn't want the mental tweaks to manifest later as a twist of consciousness, which could manifest itself in any number of ways, from something harmless, like an intense dislike of rice, to something unpleasant, like a burning, maddening desire to return to this filthy den. No, Kale wanted a better life for him, in a place where he could reveal himself in all his glory, where he would be loved, appreciated, and respected for his perseverance and hard work, and some even for his very existence, where there would be no fear, contempt, or other horrors he had endured, deprived of a normal childhood. And so now it was vitally important to break the loyalty Uzumaki felt to this rotten city. Let it hurt him. Let the boy be in pain now. Let Kale himself suffer from this. But it has to be this way. Your friend's older brother once said something very true, Naruto. The man said, a sad smile appearing on his face. The one who becomes Hokage isn't the one recognized. The one who becomes Hokage is the one who is recognized. Even your father would admit that, if he were here. Of course, out of tens of thousands, there will be a few truly grateful people, but for the most part, nothing will change. It will only get worse. The man chuckled, returning to the table. You knew him? My father! Uzumaki exclaimed eagerly, raising his head. This moment alone was worth breaking through the fabric of reality. So many emotions, pure, sincere, and incredibly powerful. Every moment spent with this boy echoed with a dull ache in Kale's heart. And with each second, a carefully concealed rage grew within him. The boy, a strong empath, would sense the shift in his guest's mood and give it its direction. It could have far-reaching consequences. Who doesn't know Minato Namikaze? Kale grinned, taking the teacup in his hand, enjoying the boy's shock. Naruto, you two are as alike as two peas in a pod, the stranger explained, staring into the bowl, but Uzumaki kept his demanding gaze on him, and the man had to insist. He asked, raising his eyebrows slightly. The smirk on the wanderer's face took on a slightly smug look as Uzumaki tasted the treat. Many acknowledged Kale's culinary skills, and it seemed Naruto would be no exception, especially considering he'd barely tasted anything other than cheap noodles from the nearest diner his entire life. Even Naruto's daily diet was on the list of questions Kale would later ask directly to the old monkey, who was killing every ounce of good feeling within him. The wanderer barely managed to suppress a grimace of anger. How many lives had the old man ruined? He'd turned the boy into an obedient idiot, a hero who, after the Great War, became redundant. In the end, the son suffered the same fate as his parents. Minato and Kushina died fighting the greatest of the tailed beasts alone. The world's greatest scientist was systematically driven mad. 3 ancient clans were on the brink of annihilation in 3 wars for the sake of. And for what? Hiruzen even contributed to the death of his own son, though he didn't fully realize it. The most terrifying thing about this situation is that he's absolutely certain he's doing it all for the village, never allowing himself to consider for a moment that his actions are undermining the root. Although, knowing what the root is. With his eyes half closed, the man told Naruto everything he could glean from the fragments of his memory. He talked about how his parents sacrificed themselves to protect their newborn son and the entire village. He recounted their lives up to that point, from their first days at the Assassin Academy to the moment of their deaths. Yes, he omitted some things for his own reasons. No need for a small fry to know he had a near older brother and a godfather, even though they were both complete slackers. For Naruto, this would be yet another reason to stay here in Konoha, which wasn't part of Kale's plans. And of course, the Uzumaki didn't need to know detailed descriptions of the bloody massacres his father had carried out. For now, Kale believed Minato should remain a figure for him, both resentful and deeply respectful. Then, when he was older, they could be introduced in person. Thank you for telling me about them, the boy said, looking dejected, modestly placing his chopsticks on top of his empty plate. I shouldn't have been the one telling you this, the man said vaguely, taking a sip of tea. That's why they hate me, right? Uzumaki asked sadly. Because they think I'm a fox. Yes. But remember, even the fox is a victim of human hatred, Naruto, Kale replied in the same tone. You can talk to him yourself and see for yourself, he said, pulling a small handkerchief from his inside pocket and carefully wiping his lips. He then raised an eyebrow and asked, Would you like that? A simple question stumped Uzumaki. Face the very reason he was hated? He knew he'd have to face the fox sooner or later, but even then, what could he say to a creature of seething rage, driving people mad with its mere appearance? And frankly, he wasn't sure he'd be able to say anything at all. But he wanted to at least try to understand the Kyuubi's motivations. Having experienced the sharp taste of hatred early on, the boy suddenly realized there was always a reason for it. He longed to know the reasons for the hatred that consumed the tailed beast, but he was afraid to admit it even to himself, because he knew the answer could be far more terrifying than he could imagine. I don't know. The boy blinked his red eyes in confusion. The stranger nodded understandingly. Naruto's thoughts were no secret to him. In truth, this entire adventure was pure improvisation. Kale had no plan, no clearly defined sequence of actions. He was acting on instinct, following a perhaps somewhat selfish desire to help them both. Because he could. Because he wanted to. Because he was interested. Because he couldn't bear to watch the grand success and grand failure of two people rejected at the beginning of their journey and rejected halfway through. The wanderer's eyes flashed like amber suns. Sometimes simple desire is enough. Words often distort and fail to convey the full meaning the speaker intends to convey. Thoughts, images flitting through the mind, and feelings that complete the picture speak far more. "He's locked inside you," the man said in a soothing tone. "If he could harm you, he would have already." The wanderer smiled reassuringly and assured the boy, "Everything will be fine. I'll talk to him first." Kale gave in, shaking his head slightly. "I'll prepare him for your arrival, so to speak." Uzumaki nodded hesitantly. He wanted to see the creature that made him hated by absolutely everyone, save perhaps his grandfather, the Hokage. Was Naruto angry at the fox? If Kale had asked him, he would have confidently answered no. During their conversation, the boy hadn't felt any negative emotions toward the Kyuubi. Now, above all else, he wanted to see his reflection. What he could become, and would become, sooner or later, if not for his strong core and unbreakable spirit. Uzumaki gradually developed a genuine sympathy for the nine-tailed beast, which greatly surprised his guest, who now didn't even notice the lingering traces of fear of the fox. Rising from the table, the man waved his hand invitingly, motioning the boy to follow him into the bedroom. The boy tensed, cast a haunted glance at Kale, and pressed himself so hard into the chair that his knuckles turned white. The man straightened up. A gleam of undisguised fury flashed in his eyes, and he took a sharp breath, realizing what had provoked such a reaction to his actions. How often? He growled quietly, clenching his fists. Uzumaki's whole body trembled as memories washed over him. How often? Kale repeated, and the boy felt as if the temperature in the room had dropped by several dozen degrees. The last time was 6 months ago, he admitted, swallowing tears. Naruto, I have no such desire. The man rasped with disgust, shaking his head. I will help you delve into your subconscious and guide you to the fox. Nothing more, nothing less. He exhaled loudly, gesturing towards the room again. And these animals. A network of blackened veins clearly showed on Kale's deathly pale face. They will live a very long time, but not necessarily happily. He promised with a smile that boded ill. Now Naruto's empathy played into the stranger's hands. Yes, Uzumaki felt anger, spreading in heavy, burning waves throughout the tiny apartment, but this fury wasn't directed at him. Like a scorching wind, it swept past him, concentrating and settling on the entire city. Kale knew his mild irritation was nothing compared to the fury of the fox trapped within Uzumaki, who timidly rose from his chair and walked into the bedroom. Only then did the man take a shuddering breath and close his eyes, the flames of his blind, righteous anger subsiding. You better lie down. The man chuckled. Stopping in the hallway, he barely moved his hand toward the old, narrow bed that in a couple of years wouldn't be enough for Uzumaki to rest properly. The boy saw nothing unusual in this simple gesture, but a barely noticeable ripple of the spatial barrier began to appear across the cleaned glass. Kale knew that those who wanted to preserve, and many who wanted to eliminate the Jinchuriki, who had fallen under the influence of the outsider, were already gathered beneath the windows. Kale himself, needless to say, had felt the urge to kill even the moment Hitaki, who had failed in his duty, requested help. He decided that the arrogant old men and the mentally unstable shinobi, mired in pain, could wait. The outsider would return, but the bijou and its jinchuriki were gone, even if they didn't yet realize it themselves. "Close your eyes," the man said softly as the boy lay down on the old bed, "and try not to think. Imagine you're falling into a deep well." Having pulled a surprisingly sturdy stool up to the head of the bed, Kale spoke quietly, guiding Naruto with a velvety voice, leading him away from the boring reality in search of the cage throughout his subconscious, while he himself examined the boy's Spartan bedroom. The stranger's gaze slid from the boy to the window. A simple security check. The shield held good. He also noticed a small vase of flowers. Simple wildflowers, which the boy had clearly picked himself. Haphazardly, just something that caught his eye and caught his attention. But it wasn't the flowers that surprised the man, it was the vase itself. It was probably the most expensive item in the room, the two even patterns on the glass surface. The too perfect shape. Simple, but that didn't make it more prestigious. It clashed with the cozy, yet still sparse, furnishings of the room. Continuing to spout nonsense, lulling the boy to sleep, Kale flicked his finger slightly, causing the vase to spin around to reveal a spiral within a scarlet circle, the Uzumaki family crest. He wondered how he'd gotten it. Most likely, someone occasionally wandered into the dead quarter and stole whatever was lying around, physically unable to. Why not? Kale was sure that most of the literature, lavishly arranged on shelves not very skillfully nailed to the walls, and the old alarm clock had also been taken from there. Where else would the guy get these things? Turning his gaze to the blonde, the stranger smiled contentedly. He had achieved what he wanted. Naruto had fallen into a trance-like state. Closing his eyes, the man sat down by the headboard, placing his hand on the boy's forehead as he sank into subconsciousness and followed him. The stranger opened his eyes and saw a far from shabby apartment. He found himself in pitch darkness. Kale would have thought he was back in that suspended state amidst all-consuming nothingness. But no, his boots touched the surface with a soft splash. With a slight tilt of his head, he knelt down and dipped his toe into the water, a thin veil spreading across the infinity, disappearing into the blackness. "Salty," he muttered, tasting the liquid and looking at his finger with puzzlement. "Interesting." The man stood up and straightened, scanning the void before him, trying to spot the boy, but he was gone. Even his gaze couldn't find the boy, lost in his own subconscious. Bad. Who knew what Uzumaki would encounter on this journey? The man irritably flicked his hand, adjusting his collar. He, the wanderer, was lucky. He was at the center of the boy's despair. The all-consuming emptiness and the blonde's unshed tears struck Kale to the core. Suppressing a flash of anger, he resigned himself to the fact that he didn't know where Naruto himself had ended up. He felt him somewhere nearby, perhaps in the heart of fear, where his nightmares dwelled, or perhaps he had been swept away to the battlefield, where the brothers' anger and rage reigned supreme. Negative emotions are the product of one part of the mind, so the blonde was nearby, and the man was worried. Naruto shouldn't face his own fears before confronting the fox. Instead, he should boost his morale. A slight effort of will, and the boy is pulled out of the quagmire of his own terrors and carried away to the plains of his deepest desires. This will give Kale time that can be spent on far more useful work. "You have disturbed my sleep, mortal. Run from here while I give you the opportunity." A deafening roar, filled with boredom and a hint of contempt, forced the man to slowly turn around to see the gigantic bars of a golden cage erupting from the floor and disappearing into the endless darkness of non-existent walls and ceiling. Kale tilted his head slightly, staring with undisguised interest straight into a huge, blood-red eye with a vertical pupil, while his mental state changed dramatically. If before a nagging void of despair filled everything around him, now, with the awakening of the Kyuubi, the pressure from that place became slightly lighter. Oh no, Kale snorted, not breaking eye contact. I didn't come all this way just to stop at the very end, the man said, his golden eyes flashing as he slowly approached the rod, which was twice as thick as he was. Do you wish to test my patience, worm? The gigantic face of a nine-tailed demon emerged from the darkness. I will devour you, he rumbled, showing a vicious grin. You have strange tastes. The man chuckled, biting his lip. Although Asians have always loved to eat worms and insects, he remarked, slowly walking along the cage. This statement apparently offended Fox. The floor shook noticeably, and ripples appeared in the water. The red giant, with his tails emerging from the darkness, lashed out at the surface, barely visible through Naruto's dark tears. And why the senseless rage? Kale drawled, wiping the liquid that had splashed onto his face. Better tell me, are you all right? He paused, biting his lips in anticipation. As the Ninetail's gigantic body emerged from the dissipating darkness, the man's attentive gaze took in, one after another, the dull orange fur hanging in enormous tangles from the Kyuubi's head, the yellow, clearly damaged teeth, the tattered ear, and the unhealed wound across its muzzle. The pelt was terrifying to even mention. Covered in scorched marks, it hung in sacks from the fox's body, as if he had lost weight overnight. In short, the mighty demon looked unwell, giving the impression of illness and emaciation. This was further emphasized by a slight limp. What are you saying, rotten thing? The low voice sounded like thunder, a harbinger of an imminent storm, but even the human's sensitive hearing could clearly hear the wheezing in it. Of course. The wanderer threw up his hands, ignoring the Kyuubi's growing mental pressure. As far as I know, Namikaze split you in half. Part of you ended up here, and the other half is being digested by the local death god. He bit his lip and spoke, his eyes widening in anticipation of an answer, but instead of words, he received only a sharp headache from the sensation of Fox's seemingly endless hatred, from which an ordinary person would have long ago turned into a vegetable incapable of thinking. So not whole. The stranger pursed his lips in frustration, looking without fear at the tail beast's vicious grin. That complicates matters. How do you know that, human? The beast rumbled, pressing its muzzle right into the golden bars. I don't know your scent. You weren't in that bug-infested place that day. That doesn't mean I didn't see anything. Kale shrugged, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Some crazy Uchiha ripped you out of Kushina's body, took control of you, and set you on Konoha, he said in a bored tone, trying hard to ignore the fox's guttural growl. And then they wrapped you up in a kid. You can't really argue with a willing victim. So yes, I saw everything, he finished, waving his hands apologetically. The fox's battered, but no less expressive, face contorted in another fit of rage. This insolent creature, stirred beneath the mighty Kyuubi's paws, dared to open its vile maw in his presence. The fox was enraged by the very fact that this piece of meat didn't reek of terror, like so many others he devoured. No one dare play with Kyuubi. For a moment, the fox wondered how much this mindless animal understood of his situation. Only the golden bars were saving this little man from being killed. No matter how much the Kyuubi wanted it, this pathetic creature of flesh and blood would speak there, beyond the line of safety. Even without this cage, he could have let this hunk of meat live. For a while. He'd been silent for too long, his voice hadn't been heard, and even longer had he gone without seeing anyone who wasn't afraid of him. Kyuubi simply missed face-to-face communication, though he'd never admit it, even to himself. However, now, after hundreds of years of confinement, he wouldn't mind talking even to Shikaku. But not to a human. Or maybe, no, humans are the enemy. I'll tell you straight, the man said, lowering his head slightly, wiping the smirk from his face. I want to help you. These words sent a bitter, barking laugh through Kyuubi, rolling like thunder through the air. Surely even Naruto heard it, even though he was in another part of his consciousness. Kyuubi didn't need help. Kyuubi didn't need sweet lies. Kyuubi had known the pain of betrayal. Having once trusted a mortal, he would never make the same mistake again. These fear-stinging worms were incapable of compassion and understanding. "I'm sincere, Kurama," the man breathed in convulsively, causing the fox to choke on his laughter. "What did you call me?" The demon's eyes flashed, pressing his pointed ears to his head. "I called you by name," the wanderer replied, closing his eyes and adding a little more quietly. "Kurama. A beautiful name. One that hasn't been spoken for centuries." A sad smile appeared on the man's face. "Now I understand. This place, it only partially belongs to Naruto," he muttered, clenching his fists. And indeed, if you look closely at the space-consuming darkness, the visible form of despair, you can see its inconsistency. There, beyond the golden line of bars, reigned true darkness. This part of Naruto's consciousness was connected to a part of the Kyuubi's consciousness. Only a small boundary and a few tones distinguished the Uzumaki's feelings from those of the nine-tailed beast. And this wounded the proud creature of pure energy. "Don't you dare!" The fox's huge eyes reflected other emotions besides the usual anger, and for a second, Kale thought she saw a flicker of fear. "Don't you dare accuse me of this weakness! You know nothing about me!" Kyuubi raged, lashing his tails across the floor. "I swear to Rakuto, I'll smash your puny body all over this place." The man merely raised an eyebrow in surprise, but then chuckled knowingly. He'd once been like that himself. Long ago, one might say, in a past life. Injustice, misunderstanding, lies, betrayal, and loss. They generate unbearable pain, tearing apart minds and souls. This pain, in turn, breeds resentment, which leads to uncontrollable hatred, which finally burns away all positive energy, leaving only cold and emptiness. The man looked at the nine-tailed fox and saw his own reflection in it. Although they had walked different paths, they had both come to the same conclusion. A flash of lingering pain briefly flickered in the man's golden eyes, then gave way to genuine sympathy. "For this feeling, I will destroy you." The fox's fur stood on end with rage that had reached a new level. "The cage won't stop me." Fiery, yet still somewhat controlled, hatred turned to resentment and anger. And the stranger understood why. Pity and sympathy are easily confused, especially if you're not well versed in human psychology. Especially if you're dealing with a representative of another society, another reality. For Kurama, this was a direct insult, an admission of his inadequacy and weakness. He simply couldn't tolerate such disdain from someone standing beyond the line of safety, naively believing that the fox couldn't reach him. "It's not pity, Kurama," Kale explained, swallowing the lump in his throat, not flinching from the deafening clang of the metal rods in front of him. "It's empathy, an act of understanding and solidarity," he said with a loud sigh, clasping his hands, trembling with tension behind his back. "I know how cruel people can be. I know the terrible deeds they commit, driven by fear, greed, the thirst for power, revenge. There are many reasons, but the consequences are always devastating. I've experienced the same." The man's sharp face rippled with change. His black hair, tied back in a long ponytail, instantly turned gray. His pale skin paled to an unnatural, deathly blue, covered in a network of bleeding scars and cracked, ready to crumble to dust. The pitch darkness didn't prevent Fox's keen gaze from discerning the black veins bulging in a strange pattern on the wanderer's face. His cracked lips instantly began to ooze blood, and his slightly pointed ears became strange stumps. But all this paled in comparison to the man's eyes. The iris of his left eye was clouded over with a whitish haze, and the gold of his right turned to a dirty gray steel, oozing utter indifference. Yes, the form had changed slightly, but it conveyed the essence very well. Once upon a time, a long time ago, one could say in a past life, his emotions had influenced his appearance. By the end of that story, he was devastated and gutted. Back then, Kale was extinguished. He felt almost nothing. Hatred had burned out any trace of emotion within him, and he had turned into a half-mad machine. He had been forced to die and be reborn in order to undo what he had done to himself. And now he saw how, slowly but surely, both the fox and Uzumaki were killing themselves without even realizing it. "It's the result of my hatred." The pleasant baritone gave way to a terrible wheeze. "It's an illusion now, but 40 years ago I was like this. Am I supposed to sympathize with you, human?" Kyubi bristled, tilting his head slightly to the side, his ears twitching comically. "What do you want?" "I don't need sympathy right now," the man replied, matching Lisu's tone in the same hoarse voice. "I want you to stop acting like an ass and understand that even in this rotten world, there are people who can understand you." "Who? You?" the fox asked mockingly, ignoring the insult slipping into the man's words. "Me. And lesser," Kale replied simply, jerking his thumb behind him. "You're very similar. He's hated as much as you are, Kurama. Every villager feels it their duty to harm the little demon in some way, be it a brutal beating or inflated prices at the market. They take out their anger on a boy who didn't really do anything, just happened to be born at the right moment." He chuckled, bringing the golden glow back to his eyes. "I understand why you dwell in this part of Naruto's mind. His despair is almost as great as yours. He doesn't understand why they treat him this way, and he wants with all his heart to change his life. And to do that, he'll need to change people, earn their respect, and extinguish the hatred raging in their hearts. And that desire. Listen, Minato, your son is hated just as much as I am." The fox chuckled sarcastically, throwing his head back. "Go on, I'm curious about my jailer's lifestyle." "He doesn't live, he just exists." Kale pursed his lips and, raising his hand, finished his sentence. "As I said, this desire is within you too, Kurama." The demon laughed again, sending distinct waves across his sagging skin. A naive fool, he thought. This boy's hatred would serve the Kyubi well when Minato's son couldn't take it anymore and lost his temper, venting his and Kurama's rage on everyone around him. And then he would burn like a candle. No human could withstand his power. After all, Shinigami comes even for the Uzumaki, and after that, the Nine-Tails would mercifully finish this mere human's work. The people of fire, earth, water, stone, and lightning all saw them as weapons of insane power, calling them demons, and this time he, the Kyubi, would prove them right with scorched cities. The people expected it, so why should he resist their will? "Right, father?" "Change?" the demon asked, choking with laughter. "No, nothing will change people. I can smell their fear a mile away, human." "Didn't you say that hatred is the product of fear?" he asked venomously. "You're right." Kale nodded, agreeing with Fox. "But I wasn't talking about peace, Kurama. I was talking about life." He smiled, taking a step toward the cage. "You're good at picking up on the moods of those around you, aren't you? Tell me, do I feel fear, hatred, disgust, arrogance, envy when I talk to you?" Kale listed, slowly walking toward the thick bars. "Take one more step, and I will introduce you to these feelings." The fox grinned, running his tongue over his yellow, broken in places, but still razor-sharp fangs. And the wanderer obediently stepped through the golden bars. A spark of compassion and kindness in this realm of despair, its sparks couldn't dispel the mingled emotions of Naruto and Kurama weighing on his mind. This mental pain. The flimsy shields of his mind sagged under the onslaught of emotion, completely drowning out the echoes of the physical pain he felt for a moment when the demon's clawed paw passed through his body. "I'm intangible," Kale said, returning to his normal form and sending a sad smile at the angry fox. "It's my curse, Kurama. I'm here only as a projection, an avatar, if you will. By here, I mean your world. Yes, I'm an outsider, and yes, I feel echoes of pain, like a barely noticeable tingling sensation throughout my body, but nothing more. I can see where such self-confidence comes from." Kyubi sneered contemptuously, kicking up water droplets with his tails. "I bet if you were standing before me in person, you'd be crawling on your knees, begging for your worthless life." Who knows? But it doesn't matter. We each have our own shackles, Kale remarked philosophically, scratching his sunken cheek. Figuratively speaking, I'm in prison too, but as you already know, there's no such thing as a perfect fortress. So you can occasionally influence Uzumaki, and I can be here. Funny, don't you think? We're similar even in that. The man chuckled ironically, resting his hand on the golden beam. You don't know anything about me. The nine-tailed one reminded again, somewhat calmer this time. The man allowed himself a faint smile. True, he didn't know the history of this world very well, but he was still well informed. Kale was curious about QB's reaction to his next words, and so he savored the anticipation, delaying the moment of satisfying his curiosity until QB began to turn away from the intangible, annoying guest. Each of you has your own name, and with your own form, which from now on each of you has. The fox, half turned away, froze, listening to such familiar words spoken in such a strange voice. One day you will be shown the right path, different from the time you were inside me. What true power is. That was thousands of years ago, Kurama said, turning around, his eyes filled with disbelief and a strange sense of resentment. I bet a chibi was a chatterbox who let his tongue slip. He snorted, shaking his head. You're the first one I've come to, Kurama, the wanderer admitted, smiling as he added, but Shikaku will be second. It's impossible to talk to this obnoxious tanuki. The nine-tailed creature lay down on the tear-stained floor and narrowed his eyes in displeasure at the man who had recently infuriated him with his perfectionism. Appreciate my kindness. I appreciate it, of course. The man snorted and bowed, maintaining a dignified posture. And I'll even forget that you wanted to crush me. And why didn't you hit me with something? The man straightened up and, frowning thoughtfully, clasped his hands, trying to find a name for the tail beast's technique, but soon lowered them helplessly and finished with a dissatisfied expression. Something. Waste my energy on you? Really? QB snorted, raising his black nose. I don't have much of it anyway, so Minato can be properly digested in Shinigami's belly. He grumbled, briefly glancing upward. That's easily fixed. Kale replied in the same tone, smiling slyly. But first, answer me a couple of questions. What happened after Hagoromo left? I know you went to the people at the Fire Temple, the man said. What happened there to make you so twisted? People happened. The fox grumbled reluctantly. Uchihas. They also set you on the temple? Kale asked with a sad sigh. Yes. The nine-tailed fox chuckled and clarified, jerking its giant head haughtily. What business is it of yours? I want to understand the reason for your social maladjustment, Kale explained, folding his hands behind his back. That Sharingan bastard, unadapted. QB flared up, struggling to pronounce the unfamiliar and complex word, his anger flaring. And I lived more or less well at the temple at first. I was its guardian, he muttered more quietly, lowering his head onto his paws. I spent 100 years there. Never killed anyone. And sometimes I wanted to. I know what Templars are like. Kale agreed with a wince, clearly recalling some less than pleasant memories of his life. You probably had a really proper and nasty old man who taught everyone how to live, and when necessary, was eager to exile the guilty, he said with disgust, and at the end, he actually shuddered. You even know old Nashiru? Kurama asked, his eyes widening in amazement. No, I once served in one of those temples myself. Kale chuckled, and a fellow old goat expelled me from the order. To his misfortune, he added more quietly, his expression darkening, but then he spoke more cheerfully. You're a good man, Kurama. I'm not a man, the nine-tailed beast said, turning up his nose. Something must have clicked in the demon's head, and he, unexpectedly, replied, You're also tolerable for a human. Now it was Kale who laughed. Even though the last part of the conversation had brought back one of the darkest moments of the man's life, now those memories helped to put QB in a more or less friendly mood. No, he harbored no illusions about him. He remained just as malicious and arrogant as ever, but his words had greatly stroked the stranger's ego. And so the man wanted to win his favor once and for all, asking the fox not to leave, to which the fox wearily rolled his scarlet eyes. Kale withdrew from this part of Naruto's subconscious to the place where he hid his deepest dreams. Finding himself in the middle of daytime Konoha, the man smiled contentedly, seeing the young Uzumaki chatting cheerfully with his adult counterpart, clad in Hokage robes. He needn't worry about the boy. He was safe here. Closing his eyes again, the man returned to reality. Stretching his stiff shoulders, he glanced at Naruto, sighed sadly, and disappeared in a flash to appear in the basement of one of the dilapidated houses in the Uzumaki district. This house is associated with one of the most fascinating yet-to-happen stories in this world. It was imprinted in Kale's memory, and so the jump was easy. Despite the passage of a decade since Kurama's attack on Konoha, this place had been left untouched, fearing the Uzumaki's death curses, while other quarters were torn to shreds. But not this one. The temple remained intact, its red brick walls faithfully serving their owners and carefully guarding their secrets. Opening his eyes, Kale grinned contentedly. The centimeter-thick layer of dust on the floor revealed that no human had set foot here in a long time. However, it wasn't the floor and walls that interested the man, but the boxes stored on a small pedestal, illuminated by clearly enchanted candles. It was here that the thing he needed was located. Right at his feet, in an inconspicuous box, lay the black and white mask of the Shinigami god, the only thing in this world that could summon and suppress the Reaper. The sinister headdress, emitting a chill, emitted a faint whitish glow from the eye slits. Carefully grasping the mask by its long black horns, the man raised it to eye level. A vile thing. Many would call his actions foolish, but the god of death in this world had no power over the stranger, and the Uzumaki clan artifact, bearing its sharp but sparse teeth, did not frighten the man. Kale turned over the Shinigami's white mask, his lips twisted into a terrifying grin. The wanderer had seen it before. The weak, frail god would offer no resistance. Everyone knew that a god's power depended on those who worshipped them, and now. The man chuckled contentedly, carefully removing the headdress from its black silk confines. Now